The wail of sirens echoed through Ouagadougou on a night no one will forget. It was not the sound of foreign bombs or an invading army. Instead, it was the sound of an entire system collapsing in a single stroke. For the first time in living memory, the most powerful executives of foreign mining corporations, men who once controlled the veins of gold and uranium running beneath Burkina Faso's soil, were rounded up and arrested in one night. And behind this unprecedented move stood one man, Ibrahim Traoré. For decades, Burkina Faso has lived under the shadow of fear and exploitation. Families have seen their land stripped bare, their water poisoned, their children growing up with no promise of a better future. Mothers whispered bedtime prayers for safety as armed groups roamed the countryside. Fathers worried about whether their children would be alive to see another year of harvest. This was not just a crisis of politics, it was a crisis of survival. On that night, many asked the same question. Could Traoré be the leader who finally breaks the chains of exploitation? Or would his bold action plunge Burkina Faso into even greater danger? For ordinary people like Mariam, a grandmother in a small village outside the capital, it was a question of life and death. Her family had already lost 2 sons to violence near the mining areas. When she heard the news of the arrests, her first thought was not politics, but hope that maybe her grandchildren would live in peace. The world is watching a small African nation wrestle with forces larger than itself. What happens here will shape not just Burkina Faso, but the stability of the entire Sahel region. And for millions of ordinary people, the answer may decide whether their families survive or perish. If this story makes you wonder what justice really means in a world ruled by power, stay with us. Because what happened next is something you have to hear to believe. Ask yourself this: if your own country's wealth was taken for half a century, would you stay silent, or would you rise to defend your family's future? The night of the arrests was unlike anything Burkina Faso had ever seen. Under direct orders from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, security forces swept through the capital and outlying regions in a coordinated operation that took down more than 30 senior executives of foreign mining companies. These were not just middle managers. They were the faces of an industry that had controlled Burkina Faso's most valuable resources for decades: gold, uranium, and bauxite, worth billions of dollars. For years, the numbers had told a grim story. While international companies exported nearly $4 billion worth of gold annually, the average citizen lived on less than $2 a day. Entire villages near the mines were forced to abandon their farmland, their soil poisoned by chemical runoff. Reports showed that in one mining district alone, more than 15,000 people had been displaced in less than 5 years. That night, government forces also discovered caches of illegal weapons stored inside company compounds. Assault rifles, grenades, and even communication equipment typically reserved for private military contractors. To Traoré and his inner circle, this was proof of something more sinister: that foreign corporations were not just extracting resources, but also arming themselves to keep control by force. For people like Issa, a 48-year-old farmer from Kaya, the event felt personal. His family's land was once fertile, producing enough millet to feed his children and sell at the market. But 3 years ago, a mining project expanded into his region, seizing land under the promise of compensation. What Issa received barely covered a season's worth of food. Since then, his family has struggled to survive on a small patch of rocky soil. His eldest son left to look for work in the city and never returned. Rumors said he was killed in a clash near a mining site. When Issa heard the news of the arrests, he told neighbors, "Maybe now, our soil will belong to us again. Maybe now, my grandchildren will have a future." The official statement from Traoré was blunt. Burkina Faso would no longer allow its natural wealth to be stolen while its people lived in misery. His government declared that all mining contracts signed under previous regimes would be subject to review, and any foreign company found guilty of exploitation or illegal activity would be expelled. For ordinary citizens, it was a moment of astonishment. Many had grown up believing that the grip of foreign companies was unshakable. Suddenly, within hours, those men who once walked freely with security convoys were in handcuffs. Some citizens lit candles outside churches and mosques, praying that this was the beginning of true independence. Others warned quietly that such boldness might bring retaliation from powerful nations who had interests in Burkina Faso's minerals. Numbers circulated quickly across the media. 32 executives detained, 5 illegal arms caches seized, documents showing more than $2 billion in undeclared revenue uncovered. Yet behind every statistic was a face, a family, a community that had endured decades of silence. The arrests marked a turning point, but they also ignited fear. Could Burkina Faso withstand the political and economic pressure that was sure to follow? Would foreign powers accept this challenge, or would they respond with sanctions, destabilization, or worse? What began as a night of arrests had become something much larger. A test of sovereignty in a world where small nations rarely get to decide their own fate. If you believe that freedom is measured not only by words but by action, keep listening. Because the real question is not what happened that night, but why it happened. And what forces pushed Burkina Faso to the edge. What could drive a young leader to take on the world's most powerful corporations in one stroke? Stay with us, because the answer will shake your understanding of Africa news and the future of Ibrahim Traoré. The turning point came when Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television just hours after the arrests. Wearing his military uniform, he stood firm before the cameras and declared in a steady voice, "Burkina Faso will never again be a colony. Our land, our gold, our future belongs to us and our children." For a country long silenced by fear and exploitation, his words were nothing short of explosive. Within minutes, crowds poured into the streets of Ouagadougou and other major towns. Old men waved the national flag, women sang traditional songs, and young people chanted Traoré's name. It was as if decades of frustration had suddenly found release in one collective roar. Eyewitnesses described how the celebrations felt both jubilant and defiant. Some lit bonfires in public squares, others marched toward government buildings to show support. For many, this was the first time they truly believed change was possible. The images broadcast across Africa were striking. A sea of people, fists raised, mothers holding children on their shoulders, elders clasping hands in prayer. In the words of one elderly teacher, "I have lived through coups, dictators, and hunger, but never have I seen my people stand so tall." Yet the emotions were mixed. While many rejoiced, others were deeply afraid. Religious leaders warned that bold moves against powerful foreign corporations might invite retribution. In some neighborhoods, fathers gathered their families inside, worried about the possibility of sudden retaliation or violent clashes. Rumors spread that mercenaries might be sent to destabilize the government. International reactions were swift. Local news reported that European embassies issued warnings to their citizens. Analysts on international channels speculated whether Burkina Faso would face sanctions or diplomatic isolation. Meanwhile, social media was flooded with debates. Some hailed Traoré as a new voice of African independence, while others painted him as a reckless soldier who could plunge the Sahel into deeper chaos. For citizens like Fatoumata, a 32-year-old nurse in Ouagadougou, the emotional roller coaster was overwhelming. Earlier that day, she had treated children suffering from waterborne diseases near a mining site. That night, she joined the march, carrying a small cross in her hand. "If he fails," she whispered to a journalist, "our children will pay the price. But if he succeeds, maybe we will finally live with dignity." Across Burkina Faso, radios played Traoré's speech again and again. Families huddled around crackling speakers, listening in silence, some with tears in their eyes. At mosques and churches, prayers were offered for protection. In markets, People argued passionately about whether the young leader's gamble would save or destroy the nation. The climax was not just in the speech. It was in the wave of emotions that surged through the people. Pride, fear, anger, and hope all collided in a single moment. The country felt alive, trembling on the edge of history. But behind the celebrations loomed questions with no easy answers. Could a nation so small withstand the fury of global powers? Would Burkina Faso's allies in the region rally to its side, or would it stand alone? And most of all, could Traoré himself survive the storm he had unleashed? If you have ever wondered what it takes for ordinary people to believe again in their own destiny, this is that moment. And yet, as history has shown, hope can be fragile in the face of power. The people have spoken, their leader has defied giants, and the world is watching. But will the world act before it's too late? Stay with us, because what happens next could decide the future not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa as a whole. In the weeks following the arrests, daily life in Burkina Faso changed in ways that touched every family. For ordinary people, the promise of reclaiming their country's wealth brought hope, but it also unleashed new hardships. Food prices rose sharply as foreign investors threatened to withdraw capital. At the central market in Ouagadougou, traders reported that the cost of imported rice had increased by nearly 25% in a matter of weeks. Families that once survived on thin margins suddenly found themselves cutting meals or relying on charity. In rural areas, the shift was even more pronounced. Villages near the mining zones began to see government forces arrive, with surveys and documents promising redistribution of land. For some, this meant the possibility of reclaiming fields stolen decades earlier. For others, it meant uncertainty. Would they truly receive the land, or would the promises fade as they had before? In one small town, 60-year-old Musa, a father of 6, stood by his barren field and said, "If they give this land back, I can feed my grandchildren. But if this is only words, then hunger will not leave us." His story echoed the fears of thousands. Politically, Traoré's government gained immediate strength. His popularity soared as he positioned himself as the defender of sovereignty. Local surveys suggested that nearly 70% of citizens expressed strong approval of his actions. But the same popularity brought new dangers. Opposition groups accused him of consolidating power under the banner of nationalism. Some even warned of the risk of another coup. Burkina Faso had endured more than half a dozen since independence. International observers noted that the balance between popular support and authoritarian control was delicate and could easily tip into unrest. The civil service also felt the shock. Contracts signed under previous governments were suspended, and ministries scrambled to rewrite regulations. Workers in the mining ministry were ordered to review over 50 major contracts within months. "We are rewriting history," one official remarked, "but it may break us before we finish." The strain was evident. Overworked bureaucrats, rising tensions between loyalists and skeptics, and growing fear of retaliation from powerful foreign interests. Beyond politics, the human cost continued to mount. Thousands of young men who once depended on mining jobs found themselves suddenly unemployed. Many turned to informal labor, while others spoke of leaving the country altogether. International organizations reported that internal displacement rose by nearly 10% in the first 2 months, as families left mining zones in search of safety or opportunity elsewhere. The emotional burden was perhaps the heaviest. Parents struggled to reassure children that school would continue, even as classrooms went without resources. Elderly citizens remembered earlier struggles and worried history might repeat itself. Churches and mosques became sanctuaries of both prayer and protest, where citizens voiced their fears and hopes in equal measure. Despite the hardships, a strong undercurrent of pride remained. For the first time in decades, many felt their country had taken a stand. "We may suffer today," said Awa, a widow in Bobo Dioulasso, "but at least my children will know we fought for our dignity." Such words reflected a resilience rooted in family, faith, and the belief that justice was worth sacrifice. Still, the consequences could not be ignored. Economic instability deepened, political divisions widened, and whispers of external interference grew louder. The arrests had shaken the old order, but they also opened doors to uncertainty. For a nation caught between pride and peril, one question began to dominate every conversation, from crowded markets to the halls of government. What would the United States do? As the most influential power in the Sahel's security equation, America's response could determine whether Burkina Faso's gamble would be rewarded or crushed. The people have borne the cost, the government has drawn its line, and the nation stands on fragile ground. But as families wonder about tomorrow, one question rises above all others. How will the United States respond? As the news of the arrests in Burkina Faso spread beyond Africa, world capitals responded with alarm, calculation, and, in some cases, silence. The international reaction revealed not only the stakes for Burkina Faso, but also the larger contest over power, resources, and security in Africa's Sahel region. In Europe, the initial response was one of condemnation. Officials in Paris called the arrests of French mining executives unlawful detentions and warned of severe consequences. Editorials in European newspapers described Traoré as a reckless soldier playing with fire. Yet, behind the anger was a deeper fear. France, long the dominant foreign power in Burkina Faso, was seeing its influence collapse in real time. The companies targeted were not just private businesses. They were symbols of decades of French economic and political leverage. Losing control of Burkina Faso's mines meant losing a key foothold in West Africa. Russia and China, by contrast, watched closely but spoke carefully. Moscow's state media portrayed Traoré as a hero standing up against Western exploitation, while Beijing emphasized the need for stability and dialogue. Analysts noted that both powers had interests in Africa's resources and could seek to strengthen ties with Burkina Faso as France's grip weakened. The arrests presented an opportunity for new alliances, but also the risk of turning Burkina Faso into another arena of great power rivalry. The United States, however, faced the most delicate dilemma. Washington had long relied on the Sahel region as a critical front in the fight against terrorism. American forces had cooperated with Burkina Faso in intelligence sharing, counterterrorism training, and humanitarian aid. With jihadist groups expanding from Mali into Niger and beyond, the stability of Burkina Faso was directly tied to U.S. national security interests. The question now was whether Traoré's bold move would help stabilize the region or push it into deeper chaos. In Washington, debates intensified. Some policymakers argued that Traoré represented a dangerous precedent, a young soldier defying global powers, undermining international contracts, and potentially inviting Russian or Chinese influence. They warned that if the United States appeared to tolerate such defiance, other African nations might follow suit, weakening Western influence across the continent. Others, however, saw an opportunity. They pointed to the decades of corruption and exploitation that had left the people of Burkina Faso impoverished. They argued that siding too closely with multinational corporations would only fuel anti-Western sentiment, driving Burkina Faso further away from America. If we ignore the suffering of ordinary Africans, one analyst warned, we will lose not just Burkina Faso, but the trust of an entire generation. For ordinary Americans following the story, the issue felt both distant and deeply familiar. News broadcasts highlighted images of jubilant crowds in Ouagadougou, but also warned of rising instability. Commentators drew comparisons to past moments in history, when small nations challenged empires and paid a heavy price. Church leaders in some U.S. communities even urged prayers for Burkina Faso, reminding their congregations that the fight for justice abroad was connected to the universal struggle for human dignity. The security implications were impossible to ignore. A destabilized Burkina Faso could become fertile ground for extremist groups, threatening not only local lives but also regional and international security. U.S. military officials quietly admitted that their counterterrorism operations in the Sahel depended heavily on stable partnerships. If Traoré turned away from the West, those partnerships could unravel. Meanwhile, African neighbors were watching with caution. Governments in Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Nigeria issued statements urging restraint, fearful that the shockwaves could spread. If Burkina Faso succeeded in reclaiming control of its resources, other nations might be inspired to do the same. But if it failed, the lesson could be one of devastation, reinforcing the idea that challenging global powers leads only to ruin. For Traoré, the international spotlight was both a weapon and a threat. His supporters hailed him as a symbol of Africa's awakening, but his enemies painted him as a reckless radical. In every major capital, the debate was the same. Was he a force for stability or the spark of a wider conflict? To families in the United States, especially older generations who had lived through the Cold War, the story carried an eerie familiarity. A young leader standing up against global giants, a small nation caught in the middle of great power competition, and the constant question of whether America would act to preserve stability or risk fueling chaos. In the end, the global response was still forming. But one fact was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer just a local story. It was a test of how the world would handle the clash between sovereignty and power, between justice and profit. If you believe that history often turns on the smallest nations making the boldest moves, then you know what is at stake here. The struggle of Burkina Faso is not only about gold or land, it is about the right of a people to decide their own destiny. And so the question lingers in every discussion in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and Beijing. Is this the dawn of a new era of African independence, or the beginning of a crisis that could engulf the entire Sahel? Stay with us, because the answer may reshape Africa News, U.S. foreign policy and the fate of Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso now stands at a crossroads, and the choices it makes will echo far beyond its borders. The arrests of foreign mining executives were not just a domestic decision, they were a declaration to the world that the people of this small West African nation would no longer accept exploitation. Yet bold actions come with dangerous consequences. Across the Sahel, instability is rising, with extremist groups already exploiting uncertainty in Mali and Niger. Analysts warn that if Burkina Faso falters, the violence could spill across borders, creating a crisis that no nation, African or Western, can easily contain. The warning signs are real. Food prices are climbing, unemployment is rising, and families are being forced to make impossible choices between safety and survival. The threat of sanctions looms, and whispers of foreign-backed interference grow louder by the day. If the fragile balance breaks, the Sahel could plunge into a new era of conflict. For Americans watching from afar, this is not just another story about Africa. It is a reminder that global security, energy stability, and human dignity are all connected. What happens in Ouagadougou today could shape the world our grandchildren inherit tomorrow. The central question remains, is Ibrahim Traoré the hope of Africa or a dangerous gamble? For the people of Burkina Faso, he is a symbol of dignity restored. For his critics, he is a soldier playing a dangerous game with forces far beyond his control. History will not judge him by his words, but by whether his people are safer, freer, and more prosperous in the years to come. Consider a scenario many experts are already discussing. If the African Union cannot unite to support Burkina Faso within the next 3 months, the country could face isolation. Without regional backing, it may be left alone against the combined weight of economic sanctions, foreign pressure, and internal unrest. The result could be devastating, not only for Burkina Faso, but for the entire Sahel region. Such predictions are not speculation. They are based on the hard lessons of history, when nations that dared to defy the status quo were left vulnerable to collapse. But there is another possibility. If Traoré's vision gains traction, and if African nations rally behind him, this moment could mark the beginning of a new chapter. Imagine an alliance of African states controlling their own resources, negotiating with the world from a position of strength rather than dependency. Imagine children growing up with access to schools, safe water, and a future not defined by foreign interests. That possibility is why so many ordinary Africans are willing to endure hardship today for the chance of dignity tomorrow. For viewers in the United States, the story of Burkina Faso should spark reflection. We are reminded of the times when our own nation fought for independence, when ordinary farmers and families took risks against powers greater than themselves. The values of liberty, justice, and family security are not unique to America. They are universal. And in the struggle of Burkina Faso, we see echoes of our own history. So we return to the question, what will come of this bold gamble? Will Traoré's actions inspire a movement for justice across Africa, or will they unleash chaos that consumes his nation? The answer lies not only in the decisions of leaders, but in the resilience of ordinary people, the mothers, fathers, and grandparents who carry the weight of history on their shoulders. If this story has touched you, take a moment to think about what it means to fight for dignity. It is not about headlines or statistics. It is about families, about survival, about faith in something greater than ourselves. And so we leave you with this call. Do not turn away. Reflect, pray, and speak about what you have heard. Because silence in the face of injustice is itself a choice. If you believe in justice, in human dignity, and in the hope of a rising Africa, let this story live in your heart. Share it with your family, discuss it in your community, and carry it in your prayers. We will return with the next chapter, because the truth does not end here. May God bless the people of Burkina Faso. May He strengthen Africa, and may He guide all of us to honor justice, protect families, and defend the future we owe to our children. This is not just a story of one man or one nation. It is a story about all of us. And the question remains, will we stand with dignity or watch as it fades away?